German colonel captured 50,000 gallons of U.S. fuel and realized Germany was doomed. December 1944. Deep in the Ardennes forest, a German panzer commander named Joachim Peiper stood in the snow, staring at something that would forever change his understanding of the war he was fighting. Before him sat 50,000 gallons of American fuel, neatly stored in drums and jerry cans, casually abandoned at a forward supply depot his forces had just overrun. It was exactly what his fuel-starved tanks desperately needed. It was the largest cache of gasoline he'd seen in months. And in that moment, as he watched his men rush forward to claim this treasure, Peiper realized with absolute certainty that Germany had already lost the war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why this moment shattered everything Peiper thought he knew, we need to go back a few days to when Hitler's last great gamble was just beginning. Because this wasn't just any random raid on a supply depot. This was Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. And Peiper was leading one of the most elite and brutal strike forces the Wehrmacht had assembled in the entire war. The plan was audacious, almost insane. Hitler wanted to split the Allied forces in half by driving through the weakly defended Ardennes region, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, it would cut off the British and Canadian armies from the Americans, potentially forcing a negotiated peace in the West, so Germany could focus all its remaining strength against the Soviet juggernaut rolling in from the east. Every general in the German high command knew it was a desperate move, but Hitler was beyond reason by this point. Germany was being crushed from both sides, its cities were being bombed into rubble, and the Führer was grasping at any straw that might turn the tide. Peiper was chosen to lead Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group that would spearhead the offensive. He was 30 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and utterly devoted to the Nazi cause. His unit was composed of the best tanks Germany could still field, including the feared Tiger, 2 tanks with their thick armor and devastating 88mm guns. His men were SS troops, hardened by years of brutal combat. They were supposed to be the tip of the spear that would tear through American lines and race to the Meuse River bridges before the Allies could react. But there was one problem that plagued every level of German planning, one issue that no amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could overcome. Fuel. Germany's oil supplies were nearly exhausted. The Romanian oil fields at Ploesti had been lost to the Soviets. The synthetic fuel plants that Germany had built were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombers. Every liter of gasoline was precious, rationed down to the last drop. Peiper's tanks had been given just enough fuel to reach their initial objectives, with the explicit understanding that they would have to capture American fuel depots along the way to continue their advance. Think about that for a moment. The entire operation, Hitler's grand strategy to turn the war around, was based on the assumption that German forces would successfully capture enemy fuel supplies in the middle of a massive battle. It was like planning a bank robbery where you only have enough gas to get halfway to the bank and you're counting on stealing the getaway car's fuel from the bank's parking lot while the police are shooting at you. It was madness, but it was the only option Germany had left. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. The Americans were caught completely off guard. This sector was considered a quiet rest area where green troops could get acclimated to the front and exhausted units could recover. The initial assault was devastating. Entire American units were surrounded and destroyed. Communication lines were cut. Confusion reigned. And through this chaos, Peiper's battle group began its advance. The first day went better than anyone had hoped. Peiper's tanks smashed through American positions, bypassing strong points and racing forward. His orders were clear: don't get bogged down in fights, keep moving, maintain speed, reach the Meuse. Behind him, other German units would deal with the bypassed American forces. He was to be the lightning, not the thunder. And for those first hours, it felt like the old days, like when the Wehrmacht had crushed Poland and France, when everything seemed possible. But even on that first day, the fuel situation was critical. Peiper's tanks were guzzling gasoline at an alarming rate, especially when moving cross-country through the snow-covered forests. The narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes weren't built for 70-ton Tiger tanks. They had to keep their engines running constantly in the freezing weather, or risk them not starting again. Every hour, every mile, brought them closer to empty. On the second day, Peiper's battle group captured the town of Stavelot, and this is where things started to go wrong in ways that would prove significant. Near a place called Bulge, at a crossroads that would become known as Malmedy, American prisoners of war were gathered in a field. What happened next remains one of the darkest moments of the Battle of the Bulge. The American prisoners were machine-gunned down in the snow. 84 men were murdered. Peiper wasn't directly present at the massacre, but it was his men, his unit, acting under the general atmosphere of ruthless brutality he had cultivated. This atrocity would ensure that American forces would fight with particular ferocity against Kampfgruppe Peiper for the rest of the battle, denying him mercy or easy surrender. It would also seal Peiper's fate after the war, but in that moment he was focused only on the advance, on finding fuel, on reaching his objective. By December 18th, Peiper's situation was becoming desperate. His tanks were running on fumes. The promised fuel supplies from the rear hadn't materialized because the entire German logistical system was a shambles, clogged with traffic jams, harassed by American holdouts, and completely inadequate for supporting an offensive of this scale. The roads behind him were choked with vehicles sitting empty. Abandoned for lack of gasoline, German units were cannibalizing each other's fuel tanks just to keep a few vehicles moving. The Great Offensive was grinding to a halt not because of American resistance, but because the Wehrmacht couldn't feed its own war machine. And then, late in the afternoon, Peiper's reconnaissance units reported something extraordinary. They had discovered a massive American fuel depot near a place called Stavelot, just sitting there, lightly guarded. The Americans had been so confident in this rear area that they hadn't even properly defended their supply dumps. 50,000 gallons of fuel, maybe more enough to fill every tank in Kampfgruppe Peiper and get them to the Meuse with fuel to spare. It was exactly what they needed. It was the miracle that would save the offensive. Peiper personally led the assault on the depot. It was a brief, sharp fight. The American engineers guarding the fuel dump tried to destroy it, setting some of it ablaze, but there wasn't enough time. The Germans overran the position and secured the bulk of the supplies. 50,000 gallons of high-grade American gasoline along with spare parts, ammunition, and food. For a brief moment, Peiper's officers were jubilant. They had done it. They had solved the fuel crisis. The advance could continue. But as Peiper walked through the captured depot, something began to gnaw at him. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. This wasn't a main supply depot or a strategic reserve. This was just a forward distribution point, one of dozens, maybe hundreds, scattered across the American rear areas. The fuel was stored in standardized containers, neatly organized with typed inventory sheets listing quantities down to the last gallon. There were spare parts for vehicles he'd never even seen before. The Americans had bulldozers, earth movers, and engineering equipment just sitting there as if they were toys. There were crates of food, not the ersatz garbage German troops had been eating for years, but real coffee, chocolate, canned meat, cigarettes, luxuries that German civilians hadn't seen since before the war. And that's when it hit him. The Americans had lost this fuel depot, 50,000 gallons, and they didn't even care. To them, this was a minor inconvenience, a rounding error in their massive logistical system. They would replace it within days, maybe hours. They probably had 10 times this amount sitting in depots within 20 miles. The Americans weren't desperately conserving every drop of fuel like Germany was. They were swimming in it. They were drowning in it. They had so much fuel that they could afford to be almost criminally wasteful with it. Peiper had fought on the Eastern Front, where German units would siphon fuel from destroyed vehicles, where they would drain the tanks of abandoned trucks to get just a few more kilometers of range. He had seen horses pulling artillery because there was no fuel for trucks. He had watched soldiers freeze to death in the winter because there wasn't enough fuel to run heating systems. The entire German war effort had been slowly suffocating under the weight of fuel scarcity for years now. And here were the Americans, treating fuel like it was water. They had trucks lined up by the hundreds, all fueled and ready. They had airplanes in the sky constantly, thousands of them, each one guzzling hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel per mission. They were running their vehicles constantly, not worrying about conservation, not carefully rationing every drop. The American supply chain was so robust, so overwhelmingly superior, that losing 50,000 gallons barely registered as a problem. Standing in that captured depot, with his men celebrating around him, Peiper did the math. Germany was producing perhaps a few 100,000 tons of fuel per month across its entire remaining territory, and that production was dropping every week as more synthetic fuel plants were destroyed. The United States alone, not counting Britain or the other allies, was producing millions of tons. The disparity wasn't just large, it was incomprehensible. It was like comparing a candle to the sun. He thought about the German oil situation. The last time he'd been briefed, Germany's strategic petroleum reserves were measured in days, not months. Every panzer division, every Luftwaffe squadron, every truck convoy was competing for the same shrinking pool of fuel. Missions were being canceled. Training flights had virtually ceased because there was no fuel to spare for pilot instruction. German tanks were being deployed to the front by rail and then left sitting in defensive positions because there was no fuel to maneuver them. The Wehrmacht was being reduced to a static defense force, tied to the railways, unable to conduct mobile warfare. Meanwhile, the Americans were running Liberty ship convoys across the Atlantic, loaded with nothing but fuel. They had pipelines being built across France to pump fuel directly from the coast to the front lines. They had specially designed tank trucks, standardized fuel containers, entire engineering units dedicated to nothing but fuel logistics. The American military was the most mobile force in human history precisely because they had unlimited fuel, and they had built their entire war machine around that abundance. Peiper walked over to a stack of American jerry cans. The Germans had actually copied this design earlier in the war, calling them Wehrmacht canister. But even in something as simple as a fuel container, the differences were telling. The American cans were well made, properly sealed with clear markings. They were designed for mass production, for efficiency, for a logistical system that could afford to make things properly. German jerry cans by 1944 were often poorly manufactured, prone to leaking, because German industry was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing and resource shortages. He picked up an American field manual that had been left in one of the guard shacks. It was a logistics manual, dry and technical, but as he flipped through it, he saw fuel consumption rates for various vehicles, planning factors for supply units, tables of distances in gallons. The Americans had standardized everything, systematized everything, turned warfare into an industrial process. They had calculated exactly how much fuel a division needed per day of combat operations, and then they had ensured that amount was always available, with safety margins built in. The German approach was chaos by comparison. Units scrounged for fuel, commanders hoarded supplies. There was no reliable system anymore, just desperate improvisation. The Wehrmacht was still tactically brilliant in many ways, still capable of inflicting terrible casualties on its enemies, but it was being strangled by its inability to sustain operations. You can't win a modern mechanized war without fuel, no matter how brave your soldiers or advanced your weapons. Peiper's mind went back to the briefing before the offensive. Hitler had ranted about willpower, about German superiority, about miraculous new wonder weapons that would turn the tide, but none of it addressed the fundamental problem. Germany was being outproduced, outsupplied, and outfueled by a margin so vast that it made victory impossible. The Americans alone had an economy 10 times the size of Germany's, and they were only ramping up production. They weren't starving. Their cities, except for a few symbolic raids, were untouched. Their factories were running 3 shifts. They had more of everything: more steel, more rubber, more food, more fuel, more men, more bullets, more tanks, more planes. One of Peiper's junior officers approached him, excited, asking if they should begin refueling immediately to resume the advance. Peiper looked at him for a long moment. This young man still believed. He still thought that capturing this fuel meant something, that they could still reach the Meuse, still split the Allied armies, still achieve Hitler's vision. And why wouldn't he believe? They had just won a tactical victory. They had captured desperately needed supplies. But Peiper had seen the truth in those stacks of jerry cans and drums. The Americans could afford to lose this fuel because they had so much more. Germany needed to capture this fuel because they had nothing else. That asymmetry told the entire story of the war in a single image. When one side is capturing supplies just to continue fighting while the other side has so much that they barely notice the loss, the outcome is already determined. It's just a matter of time. "Yes, begin refueling," Peiper ordered. "We continue to the Meuse." Because what else could he do? He was a soldier. His men were counting on him. They had come this far. But inside, something had broken. The illusion of possible victory had shattered. He knew now with absolute certainty that every kilometer they advanced was borrowed time. The fuel they had just captured would run out in days. The Americans would bring up more forces, more tanks, more fuel. The weather would clear, and American aircraft would dominate the skies. The offensive would fail, not because of some tactical mistake or lack of courage, but because Germany simply didn't have the resources to sustain it. Over the next few days, Peiper's advance continued, but it was doomed. American resistance stiffened, the weather cleared, and Allied aircraft began devastating German columns. Fuel shortages persisted despite the captured supplies. The 50,000 gallons that had seemed like such a windfall were consumed in days of heavy combat and constant maneuvering. Kampfgruppe Peiper got within sight of the Meuse but could go no further. They were eventually surrounded and had to fight their way back, abandoning most of their heavy equipment for lack of fuel to move it. Of the tanks that had started the offensive, few made it back. Not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they ran out of gas and had to be blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, but the outcome was never really in doubt after those first few days. Germany had gambled everything on a single desperate offensive, and lost. The Allies would cross the Rhine in March. Soviet forces would enter Berlin in April. Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker, still ranting about willpower and secret weapons, still unable or unwilling to accept that wars in the industrial age are won by economies and logistics, not just by battlefield tactics. After the war, Peiper would be tried for the Malmedy massacre. He would spend 11 years in prison before being released. He would try to live quietly, but the past followed him. In 1976, he was killed when his house in France was burned down, likely by revenge-seeking resistance members who had never forgiven his war crimes. But that's a different story. What matters for our purposes is that moment in December 1944, when a German colonel stood in a captured American fuel depot and realized his side had already lost. Not because of that specific battle, but because of what that fuel represented. The Americans could afford to lose 50,000 gallons of fuel without blinking. Germany had to capture it just to continue fighting for a few more days. That difference, that gap in industrial and logistical capacity, was the real story of World War II's end. People often focus on the dramatic battles, the famous generals, the heroic last stands. Those things matter, and they make for compelling stories. But wars between modern industrial nations are ultimately decided by more mundane factors: fuel production, steel output, food supplies, transportation networks, manufacturing capacity. The side that can keep its armies fed, armed, and mobile will eventually win, no matter how many tactical victories the other side achieves. Germany lost World War II at the gas pump as much as on the battlefield. Every liter of fuel the Wehrmacht burned was irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed was increasingly difficult to replace. Every pilot killed was a permanent loss because there was no fuel for adequate training replacements. The German war machine was slowly grinding to a halt, literally running out of gas, while the Allied forces were operating with such abundance that they could afford to be wasteful. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last offensive because it was the last time they could scrape together enough fuel to attempt one. After that, it was all retreat, all desperate defensive actions, all fighting delays. The end was coming, and everyone except perhaps Hitler could see it. Peiper saw it in those stacks of American jerry cans. He saw it in the casual abundance of a forward supply depot. He saw it in the systematic efficiency of American logistics versus German chaos. He saw the future, and it was exhausting, inevitable defeat. So the next time you hear about the Battle of the Bulge, remember this. It wasn't just about brave soldiers fighting in the snow, or tactical brilliance or last-ditch desperation. It was about fuel. It was about one side desperately trying to capture enough gasoline to continue fighting while the other side had so much they barely noticed what they'd lost. It was about industrial capacity and logistical superiority determining the outcome of nations in conflict. And it was about a German colonel standing in the winter cold, looking at 50,000 gallons of captured fuel, and realizing with absolute certainty that his country had already lost the war. The machines of modern warfare run on petroleum, and in that regard, Germany had been running on empty for a long time. All the tactical genius, all the advanced technology, all the courage and sacrifice couldn't overcome that simple arithmetic. The Americans had the fuel. Germany didn't. Everything else was just delaying the inevitable conclusion,